Hi everyone and welcome back. This is week 11. We're going to be talking about how you work with data that's already out there, and I have some good news about this lecture, which is that it's pretty short. So you won't hear me talking for too much this week, and then you'll be able to get on with your lives. Before I get into the lecture though, just a couple of reminders. In this class, you have 3 project options. You have to complete 2 of them. The first one was due yesterday night. So in general, I will try to get these turned around as fast as I can because these are a bit more intensive in terms of grading than the discussion posts or exams. I will aim to have these back to you within about a week. So by roughly Monday of next week, you should have a grade on this. So it will be back to you before you have to turn in your second project. So you can decide based on how happy you are with this grade, whether you want to do the second project or third project or how you want to allocate those. Also, as a reminder to go along with that, the second project will be due Sunday, November 22nd, so that is 2 weeks from yesterday. And the third project will be due on Sunday, 12/6, so that's right at the end of the semester. And for that third project, remember there are 2 routes you can go, one of which involves being out in the world, and one of which you can do from your own home. So again, you need to complete 2 out of 3 of them for this class, and if you complete all 3 projects, I will drop your lowest score. All right, so talking about existing data. When I talk about existing data, I'm talking about data that has already been collected by somebody else. So a lot of what we've talked about in this class is how to collect your own data. So how to run an experiment and get data from that, right? How to do a survey and get data from that. How to do social observation or interviewing and get qualitative data from that. When we're talking about secondary data, though, we're talking about data that's already been collected by somebody else, and there are 2 main kinds. Agency records refer to data that's collected by agencies that's not for research purposes, but that you can just use, and then secondary data is going to refer to data that's been collected by other researchers for their own research purposes that you can still use. So again, agency records, secondary data, just data that's been collected by somebody else. And the people who may collect these kinds of data could be researchers, government agencies, or other sources. So anybody who is tabulating things for whatever reason can be a source of secondary data. And there are several places you can find previously collected data. A big one is government statistics and agency records. If you look on a lot of government websites, you can find statistics that are compiled by different government agencies, and many of them you can just download onto your computer and you have that data. And then some government statistics or agencies will require cooperation from the agency collecting the data. So for example, you can't generally just go to a police department or a prison and look at their website and download information about the people they're in contact with. You kind of hope that's not the case for a lot of them, but depending on what sort of research you're doing, you can often partner with an agency to get access to its data. Data from any research that has been funded by a grant, funded by a government grant, has been archived on a website that I have linked here. What's cool about this is that literally anybody can go onto the website and download any data set. And so there are hundreds and hundreds of different data sets on there. You can search by keywords to look for criminal justice or more specific areas within criminal justice. Whatever your interests are, you can do that, and then you can find data and just, again, download it to your computer. There are many other publicly available data sets as well. So the GSS means the General Social Survey. The ANES is the American something or other election surveys, national election surveys. I think I only ever call it the ANES, so yeah. You could double check that on your own time. But what these are data sets, often surveys that have been conducted by big agencies whose job it is to conduct surveys like this. And they often have hundreds and hundreds of questions on them and thousands and thousands and thousands of respondents. And these can also be just downloaded straight from the internet. And the GSS in particular is one that you'll see popping up a lot in criminology and sociology because they have a lot of questions that sort of deal with these topics as well. Another way that you can get data from somebody else is just to email them. So for some research projects, if you see that a group of researchers has a nice trove of data, it's often possible to just email them and ask, are you using this, and would you mind if I incorporate it into a study? And you may end up working together, you may not, but you can get access to existing data really in a lot of ways. And there are other sources as well. So if you just search on the internet, you can just find things that have been collected that could be used as data. So in doing research, as important as it is to know how to collect your own data, there's also so much data out there. So if you're ever thinking about, for example, doing a project in a class, or if you need to write an empirical paper for any reason in any scholarly pursuits that you might have, oftentimes you have a lot of options in terms of where you can find data to answer a research question. And this is what I said at the beginning of the slide, but just the distinction between agency records and secondary data is that agency records are collected by organizations for their own internal purposes. They're not for research, but you can use them for research if you want to. So an example of this would be data on stops and arrests from a police department. They've collected this information for their own internal purposes, but a researcher could go through and then do a study on the patterns of things that police officers are doing when making stops or arrests, for instance. Secondary data, again, is data that has been collected by researchers for purposes of their own, but then the data is still there, and there's still things you could learn from it. So for example, if somebody ran a survey and wrote a couple of papers out of it, there's often many questions on a survey that don't get touched or don't get looked at in a particular way. And so others can go in and think about how to use the data from that survey to answer their own research questions. So I've already said that like 3 times now, so I'll just leave those bullet points there. All right, so when you use existing data for research, there are a couple of things that you need to consider. So I'll talk about advantages and disadvantages of using existing data. The biggest advantage of existing data is that it's free and it's right there. So oftentimes you get access to kinds of data that you couldn't collect on your own. So running a major national survey will generally cost you about $50,000 on the low end to get a really good nationally representative survey. And that's if you do it on the internet, through an agency that just does that. Many of the surveys that you'll see reported on, and surveys like the GSS and ANES that I mentioned, we're talking hundreds of thousands to even millions of dollars to get something like that to happen. So for people who want access to really good quality data, but who don't just have millions of dollars of research money in their pocket, having access to this existing data can be really helpful. And another advantage is time. It takes time to design a survey and to run that survey and to get all the things that need to happen in place before you get the data. And that's true of other forms of research as well. I just have surveys on the brain, I guess. But whatever kind of data you're collecting, it takes time to design the study and then actually go through the process of collecting the data. With existing data, those steps have already been completed. So if you're a researcher, you can download the data, do whatever analysis you're going to do, and then you're in a place where you can start writing up a research paper. So another advantage of using secondary data is that it allows people to sort of get things out faster and to get more done than you might if you were focused on the front end of the process of actually collecting that data. With that comes a series of disadvantages, and those disadvantages have to do with the fact that, well, you're not the one to collect the data. So many choices have already been made for you that might not make the data all that well suited to whatever your research question is. So one thing is that you have no say in how the data are recorded. So, what's getting measured? How's it getting measured? If it's a survey, what kinds of questions are being asked? If it's an experiment, what are the outcomes? So all of those things have been decided already by, whoever has collected the data. If you're looking at agency records, what's a police department actually checking off when they're making stops or making arrests? Do you know, what information do you know about the civilian who's been stopped? What information do you know about the police officer who's making the stop? So the information that you ultimately have is going to be based on questions about how that data was recorded. And along those lines, especially if you're working with agency data, you have to think about who's recording the data and how motivated are they to do it well, right? So if you're relying on police officers to be filling out a card accurately about every stop and arrest, you have to think about, is there anything that they might not include or might not think about, that would be missing when you come to visit that data later on. Another thing that you don't have any choice about is the sampling procedure. And as I said before, often an advantage of using existing data is that you get access to better samples than you could otherwise get yourself, because doing a really, really good representative sample of a big population is often very costly. But on the other hand, it's out of your hands. So once the data is collected, it's collected, and you don't get a choice in terms of who's been sampled. So a way that this could be a disadvantage, for example, would be if you were interested in a group of people in the population who is a small proportion of the population. So for example, if you were interested in the criminal justice experiences of, say, people who are Native American. In the United States, that's a pretty small proportion of the population, so they would be underrepresented in a big sample, even if that sample was representative of the population as a whole. Because if it's a small proportion of the overall population, it'll be a small proportion of the sample. So you wouldn't have any choice about whether to, sample that group extra, so you just have to work with, whoever happened to be included in the data set to begin with. And then this is related to some of these points and to the first point in particular. There's also no say in which concepts are measured in a survey or how they're measured. So depending on what your research question is, you may be interested in all sorts of concepts and all sorts of variables. If you're working with an existing data set, though, you have to just hope that the people who collected the data also had that exact same range of interests. And something that often happens when working with existing data is that you'll find that it's like most of the variables you want are in there, but they're missing a few, or there's some where you have to kind of tilt your head and squint to make an argument that the variable that's actually in there is a measure of the concept that you're interested in, and so on. And a result of this is that studies using secondary data often have poor measurement and poor internal validity as a result. Because the concepts that may be of greatest interest to you as the researcher may not be what the original study was on, so they might not be measured that well. They might be measured using only a few items. And then oftentimes, if you're thinking in terms of like survey data where you need control variables in order to have that internal validity, that's often not going to be ideal either. Again, because the people who originally collected the data probably didn't have your exact study in mind to begin with. So with that in mind, I just want to talk through, we'll give some examples of how secondary data is actually used and where it appears, and then talk through what you would want to think about if you were to actually conduct a study using secondary data yourself. And here, I just wanted to make the point that despite sort of, coming from using the leavings of somebody else's research, research using secondary data is actually very common and appears in really good outlets. So all of these studies I'm going to list were published in Criminology, which, if you remember, is sort of the flagship journal of our field. This is the big one that if you get a study in criminology, you go home and you break out the wine. So the specific studies here aren't that important. You can click through to them if you're interested. But these are types of studies that have been done using secondary data sources. So these authors used that general social survey I mentioned to do a big study on death penalty attitudes in the United States from 1974 to 2014. And so using this data, they were able to get a nationally representative survey with data spanning 40 years that, deals with criminal justice topics. And again, they got this data by going to the website, clicking download, and having it right there in front of them. And I'll say I've used the GSS a couple of times. It's a really cool data set, and it's, again, just exactly that easy. This is a pretty cool study also that tracked sort of punitive sentiment, so attitudes about punishment and criminal justice, and how punitive is the public versus how do we want more leniency in the criminal justice over a couple of decades. And for this study, they actually used a variety of surveys, and they looked for questions that were asked on different surveys over time, and then were able to track, are people generally, it's like it's going to be looking backwards to you guys, but are people generally becoming more punitive over time or less punitive over time, and what's related to turns in punitiveness or less punitiveness, and it's pretty cool. So this study is called Legal Cynicism, Collective Efficacy, and the something that's behind my head of arrest that I forget, the ecology of arrest, I think. And so they were looking at data from a big study on Chicago neighborhoods. This is also a major, massive, multi-year sort of survey project that also involved going in and looking at the physical conditions of neighborhoods and a whole bunch of other things. And so here they're looking at, what people think about the justice system and how connected they feel to their neighborhoods, and then also how that tracks with patterns of arrests and things like that. So again, these are all data sets that are just out there and available to anybody who's interested in them, and you can get some really cool projects out of them. So if you're going to use existing data, there are basically a couple of steps that you need to follow and a couple of things that you would want to think about to get yourself the best study possible. The first step in using a data set is to get to know the data. So like I said before, with an existing data set, everything's been collected already. All the choices in terms of how things will be measured and who will be sampled and how will the data be recorded, all of that is already done, so those choices have been made for you. This means that as a researcher, it's really important to get to know what those choices were, because those choices will tell you what some of the strengths and weaknesses of that data are. So for example, you would want to know how the data were collected, how are they organized in whatever data set you're looking at. So is it a big, spreadsheet that you download into a statistical program? Yeah, that's a good thing to know. And then what are the strengths and weaknesses of the data, both in general and for your research specifically? So a strength of this data, as I mentioned, is often that you can get really, really sort of good representative samples. Weaknesses are often that you'll be missing measures that would be helpful to include in a study. Things won't be measured the way that you want them to be, or really anything like that. And again, what those strengths and weaknesses are going to depend on the data set that you have. So you might have a data set that has really good measures that are relevant to what you're doing, but it happened to have been collected only in a small town, in a random state, and might not be generalizable. So whatever the strengths and weaknesses of the data are, you just want to go into your research with a sense for kind of what to look out for and what to think about. The next step in looking at secondary data is to find variables that will be useful to you. So whatever concepts you happen to be interested in, you need to find some sort of variable that measures those concepts in the data you're looking at. So I'm going to use surveys as an example here, but again, secondary data can be any data that's out there already. But let's say you're interested in people's prior involvement in offending. And you get a data set, and the only measure of offending that's in there is that question asking people whether they've ever been arrested. Well, we all know that having been arrested is not the same thing as having ever committed a crime in the past. And this is for many reasons, right? So many people who don't get involved in offending, many people who get involved in offending don't get arrested. Some people get arrested who are never involved in offending. And there are also systematic patterns in terms of who gets arrested and who doesn't get arrested. And we know they sort of lie along lines of race and socioeconomic status and types of areas that tend to be more policed or not more policed. So there's lots of reasons that arrest history isn't the same thing as offending history. But if it's the only measure of any sort of prior involvement in offending that you have, that might be what you end up working with. So that would be an example of approximating if necessary. So you know you're not going to have the best measure of offending possible, but you'll have some sense for who was involved in offending if you look at arrest history instead. But going into the project, you would want to know that it was an imperfect measure of the concept that you're interested in. So once you have identified variables that are of interest to you, then you want to think about how the variables are coded. And so variable coding just refers to how different attributes are recorded in the data. And oftentimes when you're downloading a data set, it just looks like a big spreadsheet full of numbers where different responses to different variables or different attributes of different variables are assigned numbers. But in thinking about coding, you're also looking at the level of measurement of the variable. So level of measurement, if you remember way back, there's questions about like, is the variable measured in terms of something that can be counted, or is it measured just in terms of different categories of things, with a couple of options in between? So with an example of arrest history as a variable, you might download your data set, look at this arrest history variable, and find that it's coded as, have you ever been arrested? Yes or no? So that's going to tell you some amount of information. It tells you whether people have been arrested or not. You could also imagine downloading this data set, looking up the arrest history variable, and then finding a question that asks, how many times have you ever been arrested? And so that's a different question, and it's going to give you different information. So whatever your particular study is about, you have to think about how the variables are sort of coded or recorded into the data, and what that means for what you're doing and what your research purposes are. But the main takeaway here is that you're looking through this data to figure out what variables match the concepts that you're interested in, and then you have to work with however those variables were measured and recorded. So you've looked through all the possible variables that could be of interest to you in your data. The next step is to think about how best to measure your concepts of interest using the options that you have. And the two ways that you can change what you're measuring using existing data are to recode variables that are in there or to create indices or scales. And with each of these, your goal would be to improve the validity or the reliability of the measures. So I'll talk about recoding first. Recoding refers to just changing the way that the responses to a particular item on a survey or a particular variable, whatever it is, happen to be recorded in your data. So an example of recoding would be something as simple as taking this how many times have you been arrested question and changing it so that it's only two categories of people who have not been arrested and people who have been arrested. So the only thing that you've done is you've lumped everybody who answered 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more together into this grouping of 1 or more. But if your research topic was comparing people who have been arrested and people who haven't been arrested, this second coding would be closer to what you want than the first version where you have different numbers of prior arrests. So that's recoding. It's just changing around how things are measured to better suit what it is you're trying to do. Another thing that you can do with existing data is to find multiple items that seem to be related to each other, whether or not they were intended to be, and use them to create a scale or an index. Just as a reminder, a scale and an index are words for the same thing in this context, where they are groupings of related items that all measure the same topic. And you could combine those items together by averaging them or adding the scores together to get a single measure for the variable that you're interested in. So for example, if you had a survey and you were interested in arrest history, you might find a survey that asks these questions. Have you ever been arrested for drugs? Have you ever been arrested for a violent crime? Have you ever been arrested for a property crime? And if your only interest in your research study was looking at whether or not people had been arrested, you wouldn't want to use all these separate questions. Instead, you could combine responses to those questions in a way that would give you, a single scale of sort of a prior arrest history, either frequency or, again, whatever would make most sense for your research study. But again, the idea here is that oftentimes with existing data, you can find multiple items that can be combined into a single measure, which we would call a scale or an index, that would fit whatever concept you are interested in measuring. And then the final step is to analyze the data. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because here's where we get into statistics and other things that we're not going to do in this class. But the last step is just to take this and then do whatever you are going to do with it. So what you should note here is that the main areas where you need to put in time when you're working in secondary data are just getting to know the data. So figuring out what it is you're working with, what its strengths and weaknesses are, and then figuring out how to measure your variables of interest using whatever happens to be in the data to begin with. And often in doing that, you'll be working with imperfect measures, and you may have to take steps like the ones on this slide to get measures that are closer to what you want. So like I said, today is a short day. It's really just all about what you do after you've downloaded a data set that you might be working with. With this, I'm going to assign the activity, and I'll note that this activity is going to come with an example because I think it's relatively straightforward, but without an example, it might seem like it's not. So there'll be a couple of slides talking about this activity here, but it shouldn't be hugely time-consuming or anything like that. So for this activity, I want you to quickly read a little bit more about the General Social Survey. The link here will just bring you to their About page. It's pretty short, but it'll tell you a little bit about what the data is and what its point is, what it measures. As I mentioned before, the GSS is commonly used in criminal justice research, so if you're planning to stay in this field, especially if you have any sort of inclinations toward research, it's a good one to get to know. Next, I want you to click onto this GSS Data Explorer. And so as you've noticed, there are a lot of links this week, so to reach these, I think your best bet is just to go into the PowerPoint and reach them. Although I guess I'll put them in the lecture activity thing as well. So ignore what I just said. So I want you to click into this GSS Data Explorer. And what this page has is a trove of all the different variables that are included in the General Social Survey. And as I mentioned before, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of variables in the General Social Survey. Once when I was a grad student, I spent like hours reading through the entire codebook just out of curiosity to see what was in there, and there's a ton of stuff. Literally hundreds and hundreds of variables. And if you click on any of the variables on this GSS Data Explorer webpage, it will show you how it was worded. So this was a survey of the public, so these are all questions that were asked to the public. So it'll show you how the question was worded, what the responses were, and then also what years it was available in. So the survey ran from 1972, I think, and it's ongoing every 2 years. So some questions are asked every year, but some questions are only asked during specific years. This is important if you're thinking about using data from existing surveys. If it's one of these surveys that's been around for a long time and you want to use two variables together, you have to make sure that they overlap in terms of time, right? You can't see if a question that was asked to people in 1972 is related to a question that was only asked to people in 2014, because the same people didn't answer the question, so you wouldn't be able to use that together. So once you have looked in the data and poked around the variables a little bit, search criminal justice topics or search any other topics you feel like you want to search. Think of a hypothesis about two variables that the GSS would allow you to answer. So in thinking about a hypothesis about two variables, I'm looking to see that, generally, are these two variables related to each other, or does one variable cause another variable? As long as it's some statement about how these two variables could be connected to each other, you're good in terms of a hypothesis. And then I want you to tell me, how you would test this hypothesis using the general social survey. And so in doing this, you should think about a dependent variable and an independent variable. So again, this would be one variable that causes another variable. And so that's what I'm looking for specifically in terms of your hypothesis. And for this one, even though we're talking about a survey, you don't have to think about control variables. That's where you kind of get into a more time-consuming part. I want you to just think about, your cause and your effect, and then how would you measure them using this existing data set. And then that'll be it. So I want you to turn in your hypothesis that you came up with and then the variables that you chose from the GSS data in order for this discussion post. In doing so, give me the variable name, because they're all named in there, and then the wording for each of the items you choose, and just tell me how you would use the variables to test your hypothesis. And here's the example, because like I said, this I think sounds like it will be complicated, but it's actually relatively straightforward. So my hypothesis might be that people who are not religious are more likely to support legalizing assisted suicide. So there's a bunch of questions in there about sort of legalizing or criminalizing different things. There's also a lot of questions about people's background, including religion. So my dependent variable, which would be my outcome, right? So being religious would, cause you to not support this, making support the outcome. My dependent variable would be support for legalizing assisted suicide. In the general social survey, as you can find if you click around the Data Explorer, there's a question that asks people, when a person has a disease that cannot be cured, do you think doctors should be allowed by law to end the patient's life by some painless means if the patient and his family request it? And people were asked to either respond yes or no to this question. So that's the survey item. That's the wording. Its name is Let Die One. That's how it's recorded in the general social survey. So I'm sorry if you can hear my neighbor's extremely loud lawnmower through my open window, but I'm almost done here. So that would be my first variable. My independent variable, so that's the cause I'm talking about here, I would want to be measuring how religious somebody is. And in the general social survey, hang on, it's driving me crazy. The absolute worst thing about living in the suburbs is that everybody just mows their lawns constantly. They never stop. I don't know why. Like, no one cares. But now that it's quieter, we have our independent variable. So our independent variable is our cause. We have a cause and an effect. Here we're talking about religiosity causing attitudes about legalizing assisted suicide. So to measure how religious somebody is, I might use this question here, which is, how often do you attend religious services? The variable's name in the general social survey is attend, and then the wording of the question's right there, and then the possible responses people could have given to the question. So the response options are listed there. So whatever hypothesis you come up with, this is all that I'm looking for you to put in your discussion post. Two variables that match the dependent and independent variables in your hypothesis, and then just tell me what their name is in the GSS and then what the question wording actually was. And then in terms of what I would look at here, say I would examine whether people who say they never attend religious services, so people who are not religious, would be more likely to agree that assisted suicide should be made legal. So that would be how I would test that hypothesis using these variables. And that's it. That's all I'm looking for in the discussion post this week. So with this, what you should actually turn in is just write your hypothesis, and then copy and paste your chosen variables into that discussion post, again with like a one-sentence explanation of how the variables test your given hypothesis. The usual disclaimer, just make an effort here. I will say, I know last week some people had questions about how to do the coding activity that I will be answering, in the summary post this week for, anybody who had issues with it. But what I'm really just looking for is to see that you made some sort of solid effort to, give me something here. So responses to the activity should be posted to the discussion board by this Thursday, which will be the 12th. And then, as usual, comments on 2 other students' responses should be posted by Sunday, which will be the 15th. And that's all I have for you guys today, so have a great week.